Welcome to another episode of the Supply UnChained podcast. Today, we are honored to have Mr. Steve Robinson joining us today to talk about an aspect of supply chain that doesn't get covered, which is philanthropy and also nonprofits. Steve, thank you so much for being on the show. You're one of the few people who could pretty much talk about anything in supply chain. So this show could have been about literally anything in supply chain, from starting out in the warehouse to your role transforming global supply chains in all sorts of organizations. But before we get started, we'll just thank you again for making the time, and just let's maybe start out with understanding your background before we jump into how you got involved in the supply chain project, which is how you give back to the community after a very successful 40 years in the industry. So over to you, Steve. Well, good morning to you out in the Bay Area.
Good morning, Ali Raza. How are you today? Excellent. So excited to kind of catch up to you. And I've been watching this podcast. It's really insightful. You had some great folks on here. I'm just excited to be here this morning. So let's see, Ali. It's 2026. This marks, I think, my 45th year working consecutively in the supply chain space. My first job in supply chain was seasonal help at United Parcel Service in Columbus, Ohio. Just really, part of the Christmas help, and then on to Roadway Express, dock supervisor, operations manager, later Consolidated Freightways locally, dock supervisor, operations manager, and then I was one of five people tapped to come to Palo Alto in 1988 as efficiency experts for CF Motor Freight. And that was a lot of fun. We dealt with claims ratios and other things. I ended my career there, Ali, just, managing, terminals that were slighted for either closure or some major disruption. So it was the turnaround responsibility within CF Motor Freight. And it was sitting in CF Motor Freight in 1994 when the Teamsters were on strike. And, that I really had an epiphany that I think I had learned everything I could learn from the LTL industry. The UAW was threatening to break into my terminal to get their freight for Ford and GM. Jimmy Hoffa Jr., president of Local 299, was threatening to, take our families out for a casual stroll if we let these people come across our dock. It was really interesting times in the industry. And then for me, it was a great time to sort of transition. I transitioned and went to Walmart and had, 8 wonderful years at Walmart. First working and helping support the Walmart private fleet. Later as VP of Transportation, driving efficiencies there. And then yet later, 2 more roles. Head of global supply chain, and had the ability to work with some amazing leaders and some great teammates. And looking back, we were laying kind of the foundation for what Walmart did in supply chain. So as it would happen, we implemented must arrive by date and some really what I would call foundational capabilities, and then off to international, where I help drive international supply chains and everything outside of the U.S., for Walmart. Of course, it was really interesting in 2000, as part of my journey to reinvent the supply chain, I got in touch with Eli Goldratt and had Eli come to Bentonville and spend some time with me. And it was, as conversations were always with Eli Goldratt, transformational. And he talked to me about a little company that he was working with called I2 Technologies. And, and it was circa 2000, I was introduced to I2 and the toolkit that was being developed to reinvent modern supply chains was compelling. So in 2000, I went to I2 Technologies and spent several years there. Wonderful enlightenment. At Walmart, we were really all about business processes and execution, but at I2, we really start to look at the power of upstream planning. We were the first global enterprise software company, Ali, and we planned over 5,000 variables across the entire supply chain, but starting in manufacturing, where we could simultaneously plan machine capacity, labor and raw material, first inside of one plant, then inside of a network of connected facilities. And then from there, we could extend back down to suppliers with supplier relationship management. And then as we implemented order management, we went into first Salesforce automation, and then just, full order and inventory management. Just a very robust solution. It was wonderful. I was the executive vice president of product marketing and product strategy there. We made 11 acquisitions in a 5-year period of time. And as you can imagine, amassed a lot of IP. I think we had about 120 separate pieces of code on 9 application infrastructures, 15 development shops around the world, and at least 20 different release schedules. And so it was interesting. But in 2001, we launched I2 5.2, total comprehensive product footprint, one comprehensive GUI, rationalized products from 152 solutions to 6 major solutions like order to cash, and really begin having some market traction. 2001, September 11th happened, and it was a very difficult time for a company like I2. On one hand, we had assembled some of the best talent in the supply chain space, but on the other hand, our organization was distinctly, Middle Eastern in its presentation and characteristics, and it was just a very difficult time. So we saw our revenues plummet during that time for no other reason but just the sentiment of the business and being perceived as an American company, even though we're based in Dallas. Transition from I2 into private equity, and did several years as executive in residence at a private equity firm in Chicago. Then did my first private equity leverage buyout of Air Road Express. It was an international freight forwarder. And I think that was probably the point where I had the epiphany that, like many supply chain executives, Ali, we come from disciplines, might be procurement, might be logistics, sometimes it's finances or distribution. But when you grow your supply chain career under the mantle of a large enterprise, you really can't see the supply chain. You have your P&L, you have your responsibility. But until you actually have the income statement and the balance sheet and the cash flow statement and understand how they all work together, you really don't understand the true power of supply chain. You're just running a function. And so coming face to face with a private equity backed leverage buyout where everything was about debt service, and every penny, and I mean every penny, really crystallized something that I already knew. And that was that in supply chain, there's no neutrality. Either value is added or value is wasted and expended, but there's absolutely no neutrality. There's no decision, no asset, no activity, no business process that doesn't impact positively or negatively the outcomes that you're attempting to manage in supply chain. It's wonderful. So, sold the business, went to work for Transplace as SVP of operations. Spent some years at Transplace. Company was sold. Took one of the early exits, and ended up in Starbucks. And spent some great years at Starbucks, and really went to implement a cold chain. We had made 5 food acquisitions, and we're reclaiming our own contract manufacturing back from craft and packaging. So it was a real interesting time. But we moved from an ambient supply chain really to a cold chain with perishable commodities. And so I had to change processes, technologies, facilities, trading partners, the gamut. And it was and that was from 20 13, where I began consulting. A year later, I joined the company in 2014, and left, I think, in early 2016 to get closer to the family here in the Bay Area.
Yeah, incredible career. And I don't think you even mentioned that you were at Starbucks in the middle of all of that, right? So, but to your point, how did you go from private equity profit to nonprofits? Where was that? When did that change occur? How did you realize that that's sort of the
Yeah,
next thing
so
or the only thing left for you to do?
yeah, that change happened actually in 20. It really happened in 2019, and when we won the supply chain recognition award, and we went to some nonprofits and really saw that happening. It was really interesting because at that time I was also fielding an offer from Amazon to join their middle mile organization. It was a big job, big number, big job. And I sat on my sofa and I said, I don't know. Amazon has lots of talent and lots of wonderful individuals there driving supply chain. I'm not sure that they need, my support. But if I point my support at this other problem, it, it really is a bit of my calling. So, Ali, that was the win when I realized that, you know, myself, my team, my ecosystem could be more impactful working in nonprofit. So that was the win. But the why, most people don't know the why. So let me share with you the why. When I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and when I was approaching like middle school, um, single mom in Cleveland, 3 kids. My mother was a schizophrenic and had some massive childhood trauma from some things that happened early on. It was very difficult to keep a job, but she was resilient. She worked 2 or 3 jobs, but we had a stint there where we were homeless, and which is not a good thing in Cleveland, Ohio, because there's this thing called winter on Lake Erie. It's a beast. My mother took the condemned sign off of a home that Cleveland had designated for demolition and moved us in. We didn't have heat. The roof was partially not there, but we had some protection and lots of like lessons and resilience and lots of love. And even though Cleveland is, for those of you that know, it's like the home of the Superman comic. Yeah, it's one of the things we're proud of. Superman was invented there. My childhood heroes didn't wear capes. They knocked on your door at 3 o'clock in the morning and left a basket of food. But more important than even the food and the sustenance is how that level of philanthropy didn't require a photo opportunity or even acknowledgement, but it was so powerful. It left my mother with her dignity. She was a fiercely hardworking, proud woman. And so today I've had an amazing career, and my why has always been, my why has always been really unpacking why is there a disparity of like food and money when in the world. So it actually took me from Cleveland to Ohio State to get a degree in agricultural economics. Well, again, my curiosity in food and money and my supply chain career is really hallmarked by a pursuit to do the kind of reconnaissance on the systems, the processes, the origins of food and money. All right. And so that's why there's been, certain selections that I've made to understand the people, the process, the technology. I've worked in, some of the smallest companies. I've worked for some of the largest companies. I've been a transportation provider. At I2, we had 70% market share for our transportation management systems across, TMS providers. I've been everyone's largest shipper. Been an asset and a non-asset based provider, built technology, implemented technology, bought and sold technology, provided consulting, bought consulting. So really doing my reconnaissance on a 360-degree view of supply chain, and what really drove my career selections was this simple fact that when you're a builder of bridges, you have to go to where the rivers are. And this thing that we call supply chain is not just like other functional industry disciplines. It's the operating system around, how the world works. And so to get close to it, you can't spend 30 years as a retailer or 30 years, on the logistics piece. You miss the depth and the breadth of what's really there. Um, the why is, I think that there are some systemic issues that nonprofits have that can be solved if we point the power of the supply chain lens toward the opportunity. There's 120 million supply chain practitioners that are estimated on the planet today. And as you think about, what's happening right now, I mean, in this moment right now, if you talk to all the experts, they'll say, well, supply chains are moving from being predictive, based on predictable optimization, to the resilience that happens when you can sense, respond, and scenario plan. And it's like, well, wait a minute, on that side, we were dealing with supply variability, but it was like 3 to 5% supply variability. You write the purchase order, your supplier pretty much is going to ship it. You only had to manage whether it got there on time or in full, but not whether it got there at all.
Yeah.
And your demand variability, well, the processes were pretty good. You had 70%, forecast assurance with about 30% forecast error. That was pretty good. And we developed processes like post-receipt dynamic allocations and other things to kind of help round that up a little. On time, in full, must arrive by date management, and you're in the ball game. Now contrast that with a nonprofit. All right, particularly when I say nonprofit, the humanitarian nonprofits, Ali, that are distributing food, medical equipment, medical supplies, clothing, health and beauty aids, pharmaceuticals, right? Arranging shelter. The supply assurance, well, they've got like 80% supply variability at any given time. Okay. The demand variability, well, it depends on whether you're talking dark skies or blue skies. The dark skies obviously are the kind of disaster driven. Those don't always, they're not very predictable, right? The
Yeah.
blue skies are the everyday disasters. Now I'm just going to drill into that just a little bit. We've got pretty decent systems here, not perfect, not always adequate, but comparatively better systems to deal with humanitarian issues. And we've got organizations, Kathy Fulton and the American Logistics Aid Network do a tremendous job. And if you have any capacity, excess support that you can lend during the disaster, please go to allenaid.org, talk to Kathy and her team. They've got years of doing a great job. But the need state is balanced between blue skies and dark skies. One of the challenges that the over 500,000 humanitarian nonprofits have is resource allocation. So here's what it looks like today. A disaster happens. We have great warning systems. It's the news, the weather channels. We're all plugged in our devices. There's a little bit of a window. There's some predictability. And now we can rally the jets, call the Avengers. We got celebrities landing their planes for the photo opportunity of, being helpful and, being helpful in their own way. And as a kind of a global community, we kind of come together around that. And that is good. We can't do enough of that, right? But we know when the disaster is abated. You know how we know when the disaster is abated? Because we get back in our Mercedes Benzes, we drive back out to the suburbs that have now been sort of repaired and put back together. We're no longer experiencing houselessness and food insecurity the way some people experience it every day. And we're able to drive by those people living under the bridges back to our gated communities, and everything's been put back in order. But What about those people that are parentally living, you know, below the line, and the line keeps moving? Every time there's an increase in minimum wage, the line moves. Every time there's an increase in healthcare costs, the line moves. Another two or three IPOs here in the valley where the affordable housing is bidded up and purchased, the line moves, right? A personal mental health event, or catastrophic health event, the line moves. A layoff happens because AI happens, the line moves. And so the line is moving faster than the systems to kind of help recover and get people employed and back to the right side of the taxpayer's ledger.
And to your point, right? How I mean, what can nonprofits really do? Because to your point, there's a resource allocation problem. There's probably a focus issue as well. Dark skies versus blue skies. How is the supply chain project addressing that, or a part of that today?
Well, we've got a long body of work. So first, I'll kind of give you context. Ali, just the research says that a Silicon Valley company, in order to go through, their growth stage, product market fit, and then through some commercialization that takes the commercial risk off the table for an investor, it could happen 10 to 12 years, and it kind of bumps along. And then year 10 or maybe year 12, the overnight success happens, and you see the hockey stick growth. Some companies have sort of had escape velocities. Companies like Perplexity and OpenAI, 2 years hockey stick growth.
Yeah.
Nonprofits typically see a 20-year trajectory of earning the mission-driven, respect and credibility to be an ongoing concern, and develop, a base of donors and supporters that believe in the mission. So it's like 20 years before they even sort of get that pop and that fit. So being a nonprofit game, it's a long term game. We've got 4 phases that we're focused on here. So first, and these are like what I call the 5-week links for those nonprofits. So first is just the supply demand mismatch. Ali, we live in a world today where here in the U.S., we consume about 82% of our own gross domestic product, almost more than anyone else in the world. That's what makes our economy so resilient, hyper consumerism. But we also consume, like 80+% of all toys manufactured. New movie, new toy, new character, new toy, new season, new toy. Let's invent holidays just to invent toys. We have more wardrobe changes than any other country, and seasons and the fashions and new product development and introduction drives the fashion industry. It drives the consumer products good industry, and so we're at what I call peak need. Last year, NRF estimated retail returns were 950 billion with a B. The year before, I'm sorry, 850 billion with a B. The year before, it was 890 billion. In 2023, it was about 748 billion. So you can see that number kind of continues to edge up. There's consistently 9.5 billion pounds of waste going to landfills every year. I can't say there's a correlation between the retail returns, because there's some secondary markets and liquidation in other markets. We can't account for what gets destroyed. But we do know that whatever these systems are, the hyper consumerism on one side driving retail concerns or returns, and then the relentless pursuit for unit cost efficiencies from manufacturing, driving what is ultimately some of the waste, right? So my daughter buys 3 pairs of shoes when she goes to Amazon. She wears, let's say like a size 7.5, but she'll buy the 7s and the 6.5s because the sizing isn't always consistent depending on where it is. And hey, come on, let's face it, psychologically, the 6.5 or the 7 feels, better, or maybe they're even cuter. I don't know, but she'll buy 3, try them on, keep the best ones, send them back. E-commerce has moved you know the dressing room to our living room and has accelerated the rate of returns. Those returns don't always go back. The public believes that, but after all of the cost elasticity has been sort of consumed, there's very little motivation for any company to invest in just the time, the touches, the carry, the transportation, and it's already depreciated, way below your break even and starting to get close to zero. So that product kind of accumulates. On the manufacturing side, that manufacturer's MOQ presented to procurement has nothing to do with what procurement's going to consume. Procurement's EOQ to get the purchased unit cost efficiency is really removed again from what's going to be consumed. And then when we start layering on that seasonal forecast, that new product development and introduction forecast, that forward buy, I can go on. There's like 10 categories where things are purchased and exchanged. We call it demand in someone's planning system
Right.
because that's kind of how we food ourselves to drive it. But at the end of the day, it's just sitting on someone's balance sheet or in someone's warehouse, or it's an underutilized asset somewhere in the system. And it ends up magically, it ends up as waste. It's wasted capacity, it's wasted raw material, it's wasted work in process, finished goods, it's wasted labor. It's just that the drive for efficiency doesn't account for, in all cases, consumption and utilization.
Yeah.
All right,
And
so here's the big premise. We're at peak waste and we're at peak need. And so this matching problem isn't just a nonprofit matching problem. It's like a societal matching problem to take the waste and the need and find, just better pathways to support matching. So that's the first thing we're working on. Is we're working on matching in a very definite, discrete way. Next is visibility. It's visibility to available capacities. We kicked off an initiative this year called Available to Donate. We partnered with the Domestic Manufacturing Supply Chain Alliance, DMSCA, and we are taking on design partners to identify available to donate capacity. And it really is simply saying if there's price elasticity, there's also value elasticity. And if we can identify potentially wasted products earlier, then we can create alternate pathways. They might be sustainable pathways for circularity. There may be opportunities to donate it. And here's a tip. If we can identify products that can be donated before they're at that stage to where they're either a return or they're a write-off, the tax code provides up to 2x the value commercially for that product. So there should be not an altruistic motivation, or a philanthropic motivation, but a fiduciary responsibility to identify that value and be aggressive about reclaiming it. And so that when we say availability and poor visibility, it is to resources.
yeah, Steve, you've covered some of these numbers, and it was actually pretty shocking to me. I mean, we always knew there was waste sitting or available space sitting in warehousing and trucks and shelves and anywhere in the supply chain. But some of the numbers, when you started communicating this whole available to date, almost creating like a parallel universe of a ghost supply chain for philanthropic efforts. Maybe just get into the numbers of like how much space is like sitting in your typical Prologis center or a Penske truck, or yeah.
Yeah, I think they have it. The point is, it's kind of a proprietary number for them. But let's just say your public storage. I talked about how consumer-driven our economies are. When we fill up our homes and our garages with all of this stuff, it goes to one of the outside storage, locations. They average about 92% occupancy at any given time. So in other words, there's 8% capacity. If you talk to the local nonprofits around what some of their supply chain logistical challenges are, they're like, oh my gosh, I have a guy in New York that'll donate a truckload of diapers that I desperately need for my community. I just don't have a place to store them. And I can't afford the transportation. So I'm going to unfortunately say no, to that. If only I had an interim storage facility for 30 days, 60, 90 days, it would be perfect. But there's nowhere to go, right? And so if we're able to kind of match that excess capacity with the local on-demand needs at a rate that makes everyone whole, but do it holistically and systemically across the country, great. Cold storage, another opportunity for local nonprofits that really need that support to maintain their ability to handle food safely and extend, kind of the food life, extend the perishability till it gets consumed. Here's an interesting one. I think I'm safe to share this number because it's a 25-year-old number, but in 1995, there, as a leadership team for the Walmart fleet, we were driving about 900 million miles a year, uh, and those miles were empty. So, two directors, myself and just a great guy I work with, Tim Yatsko, we put our heads together and figured out that if we got inter and intrastate authority for the Walmart fleet, then we could start picking up our own truckload backhauls, and we did that. And generated hundreds of millions of dollars in not just deferred cost, but also had some third party support and generated revenue. And then we created our own center point network to handle our LTL, and we could do that 30% cheaper than anyone. But Ali, we took the empty mile percentage from 38% down to 17%, and we're like,
Wow.
we're getting close. We're gonna get it down below. We're gonna get it to single digits. And no, we couldn't get it to single digits, and we couldn't get it to single digits because of the simple fact, again, whether I'm working for UPS, FedEx, Consolidated Freightways, Roadway, the Walmart private fleet. The reality is that anytime you impose a time definite pickup on your rolling stock or a time definite delivery, your SLA is paid for by a lack of efficiency and utilization that you're willing to accept. So you can't simultaneously have an on-time delivery and 100% driver and trailer utilization. At some point, you've got to abandon alternate missions and reposition that equipment to be available and have the capacity at the right time, right place, and that comes at a cost. But what you can do is that if you can define alternate missions that have not a lot of dwell time at stop, not a lot of incremental miles getting off and getting back to route, then you can capture some of that excess capacity. My premise here from a supply chain project perspective is that, I sort of say tongue in cheek, we can capture 1% of excess capacity. The reality is that excess capacity is everywhere. It must necessarily coexist with your ability to do time definite delivery. Yet I was at a Ben Gordon conference, BGSA conference. Ben puts on a wonderful conference in Florida, every year for logistics executives. And I asked the question, you may have been in the room, Ali, and I said, how many of you are donating 1 or 2% of your capacity, to charity? In a room of 300, logistics executives, there were maybe 2 or 3. And but if we were going to sit down and have a real conversation about how many empty miles exist, and and that's just in a truckload sector or an LTL sector. What if we were to look at box trucks, the trucks that are delivering to Amazon? What if we looked at the trucks every day, outer belt, with fresh produce and deliver it inside the urban areas to restaurant and food service locations? What if we looked at Uber drivers? What if we looked at the trucks that sat idle over the weekend? You know, I live about 10 miles as the crow flies from a Feeding America facility. And when I visit the facility, it's wonderful, it's beautiful, but it was empty. Well, why is it empty? Well, you're around the corner from a Walmart supercenter. I can tell you how much waste comes out of a Walmart supercenter. That's why Walmart's the number one donor to Feeding America. But why is it empty? It was empty because they didn't have transport capacity to bring the product into their facility. And once they had it there, downstream, the battered women's shelters, the homeless shelters, the food banks, etc., there was no transport capacity to kind of complete that part of supply chain. So repurposing, supply chain matching is one, visibility is two, transport warehouse capability is four, and then later we'll talk about some of the innovations that we're bringing to repurposing labor so that there's more local labor capacity to solve problems. I'll put it this way. When we look at the $850 billion, there's a great nonprofit called Good 360. Don't know what their numbers were for 2025, but for 2024, they processed about $4 billion of retail returns and sent them to nonprofits downstream, either sold or donated. But on a base of 890 billion, why couldn't they do more? Lots of reasons, but a primary reason is that the constraint exists downstream where the local mom and pops simply don't have the people, process, space, budget, real supply chain constraints. And that's kind of why we're here.
Incredible. And to your point, right, from most of the food donation efforts I've ever been part of, or like Salvation Army, Food Bank, you name it, it seems like everything's being done by storing stuff in the basement, garage, and hauling SUVs worth of stuff around. So is that just the infrastructure that the local communities and these nonprofits are they know about, or is just that they haven't sort of reached out to some of these larger organizations that can help, who can provide that cold chain infrastructure? So what's the disconnect? Because there's plenty of people, to your point, right, that there's all these nonprofits looking to donate, but they don't seem to have that logistics infrastructure outside of their 5 mile radius, to be exact, right? So if they want to start looking at interstate, intrastate movements, like how do the small little, like small mediums nonprofits get involved with the big ones, right? I think that comes back to our question on transportation, resource, and other allocation challenges that we have.
Yeah, that's that's a $64,000 question, Ali. I think it gets down to maybe three things. The first, and I think the most powerful, is that no organization, no matter how big or how small, really has the resource and the capacity to work with lots of fractured, splintered, one-off relationships. Okay, and in our quest to be philanthropic, the IRS allows anyone, to create sort of a nonprofit, and then it becomes its own entity. Now that entity has to compete for resources, for money, for attention, and so there's an underlying level of competitiveness just for their own survival that they kind of help adopt. But if you're an organization and maybe have excess food or excess capacity, you just can't deal with 100. You can deal with a network. You can deal with a major that has some downstream capability, but your people, your processes, your systems just can't handle thousands and thousands of requests, and each one's a one-off, meaning they don't have the automation. It requires some special consideration, some special sort, time, touch. It's an issue. So dealing with the network that has uniform policies, certain procedures, certain capabilities is an easier thing to do. Well, we're one of several networks that are sort of presenting themselves as um, a way that large brands can sort of work with. And then by proxy, we deal with the complexity of the heterogeneous group of nonprofits behind us, right? So, that's one. Two, not everyone is digitally enabled. And so, if an organization is going to work with you, they got to onboard you just so that there's a basic communication transaction. And now in the age of cybersecurity, they have to authenticate you and validate you and really interrogate, what their touch points are. That's you coming in. And if you come in and you have a relationship, now they have an obligation to protect your identity and your data and. So you can understand it was always complex, but now that everything's digital, it's even more complex, right? And then third, it's just the focus. This isn't really everyone's core mission, and the more it consumes, resources and time and attention from, you know, if you haven't noticed, staffs are getting smaller.
Yeah.
They're getting leaner, and the level of competitiveness has never been higher. So you got to pick what business you're in. You got shareholders, you got customers, you have employees, you got obligations that are real, and that's your focus. And if there's some left, you can pay some for it or give some back. But we've just got to make it easier for enterprises to engage with nonprofits. Now here's the bad news: as enterprises become more digitally enabled and AI enabled, the trend for nonprofits isn't keeping track.
Yeah.
So they're getting lower on their digital enablement, and at some point, there's going to be such a massive gap. It'll just be unprofitable to engage with nonprofits unless something happens. Well, our mission and our vision is to not just digitally enable those nonprofits, but try to rapidly bring them up the curve as it relates to their ability to be conversant, utilize, and benefit from AI.
And to your point, where do they find the money, right? So I guess a good example is like local food bank here moves about $1 billion worth of food to all sorts of schools, homeless shelters, etc. And to your point, there's like maybe multiple agencies running it, so nobody understands where the digital footprint starts or starts until you start connecting it. But is the solution public-private partnerships? Is it public nonprofit partnerships? Where can these organizations, nonprofits that understand, like to your point, like you understand the entire mechanics end to end of how to move stuff, where the capacity is. How do you get the funding to do the job or realize the opportunity that is there today, that not many people realize today, right? I mean, I've spoken to food banks over the years, and they're still stuck in their digitization, and I don't know if they're ever going to get to it. But it's a lot of whiteboarding and trying to understand what's going on versus bringing in someone like the supply chain project or some of the other angelic AI stuff that you do, and just saying, okay, this is how it's done, and this is how we get more, milk boxes to this high school in the Bronx, for example.
Yeah, Ali, one of the first thing, I tell my staff all the time, this work isn't for the faint of heart. Because one of the first thing that you learn when you set out to kind of do good and help people is, much to your chagrin, they don't want the help. They don't want the help. They don't need the help. I mean, if I had a nickel for every time I had a conversation, and I'll paraphrase the conversation to say this way: we don't need all that fancy for-profit technology and stuff. Me and Gertie's been doing this for 30 years, and we're darn good at it. And we just, get out of here with all that hanky-panky for-profit stuff. We know how to do this. And that's not typical, but there is a pride of ownership. There is a level of intrinsic reward to know that you're sort of standing up against this tide, right? And that this immovable force, and whether it's kind of poverty or whatever, and you're standing there, and then somehow some people are diminished if they accept a little help in that regard. So it's a subtle nuanced effort, but there's a solid core of resistance. I would even say resentment for people that don't have a 20-year pedigree of working in nonprofits to transition over. It's like you haven't earned your street cred, and you can't help. So, you know, you got to ignore it and press on. But that's just a particular, human thing. It keeps some people from supporting. Now, I don't want to miscolor it. By and large, the most amazing people that I've met, innovative, hardworking, wicked, whip smart people, are working in supply chains, in nonprofits, and they are doing magic. I remember leaving Walmart and then standing on a dock at Gobble, thinking, "Wow, I had 80,000 people, at one point in my organization, and incredible support." Large organizations like Walmart or Starbucks that just have a culture that provide incredible support. All you really need to do is be humble enough to ask for help. It comes through the woodwork. People show up. Well, wow, why are you guys from Menominee, Wisconsin here? And well, we were just, here. No, you weren't here. They came to help. It was amazing the help that you would get from all over the business. And then you're in a nonprofit. You're staring on one side at a stack of stuff that's been dumped at your door, and then you got to find the labor to sort and segregate size, color, clothing, gender, season, stained, ripped versus clothes that you can give to kids that have dignity. And then over here, you don't have the labor. Your volunteer shift just, kind of called off. And then there, you've got the need state. There's a line around the corner of people, wanting your whole back office operation, and they do it effortlessly. And it's like, oh my God, you should be running like the entire, Western division for, some major e-commerce company, but they're running just a little corner on Main Street where their nonprofit are essential to how that community works.
That's
Amazing,
It's
amazing.
amazing. Yeah, just it's just how people with so little resources are able to achieve so much, and just in good faith, and trying to do good for people. And to your point, right? One of the things that often happens in Silicon Valley is the minute you make it big, people start foundations, and then ta-da, there's another nonprofit. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, is it better to just maybe get involved with an existing nonprofit, and donate your money there, or get involved and understand the space? Because ultimately what I've seen is, if you have too many organizations all trying to do good, there's just not enough resources. And ultimately what ends up happening is they end up consolidating to say, okay, we're all trying to do the right thing and be good, and doing this for food or education. So let's all come together. So your thoughts on, if you're in a position, should you be contributing to an existing nonprofit? Or most people, they'll be like, no, I want to do my own thing, and then they don't fundamentally, to your point, understand how nonprofits are set up and foundations are set up, and then they realize they're on that 20-year journey, again, even though they were on a 10-year journey, exiting a company, and now want to do good with their funds.
Yeah, wow, you just unpacked a lot there, Ali. Nonprofits have become, sadly enough, kind of a vehicle to support, vanity, and people want a nonprofit. They want it named, after them. They want to be perceived as giving back, and sort of good washing their reputation and leaving a legacy. All, great and noble things, but if you really want to have an impact, there's going to be just 3 or 4 or 5 nonprofits. And I would say be hyper local. Nonprofits operate best when they activate the local ecosystem. Excess capacity, givers that live locally can see and understand what the work is and what the impacts are. Helping the local communities, right? Be hyper local in your giving. Volunteer so that you come face to face with the real need state, right? And get your hand. Go call on some homeless people. Go interview some homeless people, and really get whatever the stereotype of these 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 losers are, and talk to the my mom died, we lost the house, I lost the job, and but I have a master's degree and I can't find employment and I can't find housing, right? uh, you know, you know, my husband got sick, had pancreatic cancer, and between diagnosis and it was like 6 weeks, and we lost everything, and it was so not affordable, and start to really unpack what you think homelessness is, or addiction, or any of these issues, and then you'll move away from just starting a nonprofit or joining these nonprofits, to understanding the dire state that the humans are in, and uh and if we sort of consolidate our money, our time, our interests, our capability, then it's amazing. I cite 120 million supply chain practitioners on the planet, because I really believe in this space of supply chain. I think the supply chain folks, marketers have had their day where they're talking about the triple bottom line, and politicians have done it. I think it's the moment when supply chain people step up, because supply chain saves the world. By the way, I own that URL,
Nice.
supplychainsavestheworld.com, supplychainsavestheworld.com, because supply chain practitioners, not only do they understand more discreetly how the world works, but today, the 120 million people that I said working in supply chain have trillions of dollars in spending authority, and the ability to kind of prioritize that. And then collectively, we all have this disdain for big, obvious supply demand
Mismatches. Yeah.
mismatches. I, my phone lit up when there was a news article and they were showing simultaneously farmers in the Midwest plowing crops under during COVID because they needed the land, and then others in like Texas euthanizing entire cohorts of like beef and poultry. And
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And it 75 years ago, everybody had a local butcher shop in your community. And you went there and you bought, a couple chops for during the week and maybe a nice ham for Sunday dinner. Uh, well, now all of that processing sits under roof in a 5,000 square foot facility in Nebraska that went offline because COVID, affected the workers. And now all the cohorts of poultry and beef and pork, uh, you know, eh, you know, in the U.S., one entire senior class had to be
Yeah.
euthanized because they needed that for the next groups that were kind of coming through. They needed the feed, the stalls, the space, the transport capacity, all euthanized. Well, the point is, we've taken the world, and in the supply chain of the profit motive and unit economics and convenience has optimized systems. And so we can deploy the same science, technology, and people that sort of created this environment where we have, peak waste, and then point that needle toward rectifying the peak waste, peak need conundrum.
It makes sense, and that's the big question we have with all the supply and demand matching, and the stock market being where it is today. Why does it feel that more and more Americans are poorer than ever, right? And that's a debate I probably wouldn't go into it. But just coming back to your point, right? Um, the local efforts and helping meet the supply demand matching. In the Bay Area, we have all sorts of people sitting like yourself. We're based there as well. So looking at the Bay Area and the logistics that happens in the East Bay, and then obviously all the wealth in South Bay and then up in San Francisco, what do you think could be done locally, at least, to enable that supply demand match? So at the beginning of this conversation, we were talking about just the homeless population in the Bay Area, and to your point, right? I mean, there's a lot of people you can speak to. I've spoken to many people put them into Airbnbs, for a week or so, and got in trouble with the Airbnb because I wasn't there. But that's a different story. But to your point, like, why are we not? What can we do locally? Because we're all based there. We have all the ideas in the world, and all the capital in the world. But why are we so bad at supply demand matching in the Bay Area? And why can't we use this ecosystem, which seems to have everything, talent, infrastructure, funds, to create an environment where we at least solve the supply and demand mismatch locally before we go about and pitch it to other states, like, I don't know, Arkansas or New York or wherever that might be in the rest of the world.
Yeah, great question. So, Ali, I'd probably answer it this way. I'd say as long as we make, our humanitarian efforts, philanthropic based on altruism, they'll never succeed. And they won't succeed until doing good is good business in a tangible way. So it's got to show up as even more than a donation, on a P&L. If we're able to take the millions of square feet in abandoned office real estate and repurpose even a portion of it to be able to support, at least on a temporary basis, homelessness, that's a major thing. Finland solved their homeless problem some years ago. Just automatically, everybody gets a home with a lock, a door, and a key. And
Yeah.
what they found is that is the fundamental stability minimum acceptable requirement to be a functioning citizen. Because with that, you can have a job, you're less of a burden on the taxpayers. You can work through your own food systems. You can do all the things needed. But if you ever fall below the standard of having a home, then you are forever a ward of the state and will be
Wow.
net consumer and not a net contributor. Right. So I would tell you there is enough real estate under roof, unoccupied, unused, um, to house even the 40%. Again, nobody has like California. There's enough space there and we could, and enough land that if we said we wanted to relieve the state of California of a portion of its tax burden of managing these 40, and we made that a singular focus instead of, you know, the spotted owls or the whales. And don't get me wrong, there's great nonprofits that are cleaning the ocean, saving the
Yeah.
whales, saving the spotted owls. But if we're talking about saving the people, then we can bring our funding together, have several mass initiatives, and just draw the line and say that at this point in the future, homelessness is going to go down. And, it's just, we just have to, I'd like to say it's a sophisticated solution. It isn't a sophisticated solution, right? There's this wonderful movie, where I think it's like Apollo 11, where Tom Hanks is Jim Lovell, and he's in his backyard watching Neil Armstrong take the flight to the moon that he wanted to take, that he should have been there. And he's talking to his wife in his lawn chair in New Jersey, and he's just really hacked off. He says, "They didn't do anything special. Why is Neil going? They didn't do anything special. They just decided to go. They just decided to go. That was all. That's all they did." But it's a powerful discussion, right? Because it basically says that, when Kennedy stood up and gave the speech in 1960 that we will go to the moon in this decade, and not because it's easy, because it's hard. He was summoning the collective will of the country to say, we can do this. We're going to do this. So, whenever we want to take that 40% homeless number down to 20% or 10% or 5%, just takes a collective will, and forget about politics and positioning and it's liberal and it's whatever. It's a net consumption tax on humanity, and we all
Correct.
pay. We all pay for it, and we can do better.
No, I truly believe that 90% of the battle is just showing up, right? And I don't think, and then the rest is just staying power, right? And that's basically what you're left for with resources. And to that, right? I know we're almost at time, but Steve, what are you working on these days? I know supply chain project is something that you've been trying to get more people involved with. You were going to speak to some of the technologies you're developing. Angelic AI, I know you were over at Davos pitching this new vision of supply chain. So, and not many people know how much you do in a day. I think you have like 12 or 15 different initiatives going on, and easily the hardest worker I know in this space. But on that point, what are you working on these days? Where do you think supply chain project is headed? How do you get involved with supply chain project? You and I could probably do a live stream for another 6 hours, and we can cover the entire geopolitics and supply demand matching of the other things you do. But over to you.
Yeah, so I really split my time principally between two major things. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that in 2019 we started not just supply chain project, but we started a for-profit business, a telehealth company. I will till
Yeah.
I'm well. We have 25,000 mental health therapists nationwide. We have over 5,200 doctors. We even have veterinarians, and we have a very robust offering. We built it for the people. Again, I'm still speaking to honoring my childhood. I talked earlier about my mother with her mental health issues, and then our just having to work with local community nonprofits, and the supply chain project service that. But here, we're bringing affordable access to mental health and just your family's right to see a doctor, regardless of big employers, big insurance, big pharma networks. And that's pretty successful. That's I will tell them well, nationwide telehealth platform, English and Spanish, all virtual. That's another thing to for me to focus on. But then in supply chain project, we've partnered with great organizations, a startup here in Silicon Valley called Orchestro. Shaker Natarayan and his team at Orchestro, really are driving not just a level of what I would call standard optimization, right? Where we're optimizing variable A subject to constraints B and C. But they have over 250 patents around something called angelic intelligence. And I'm not the expert, but here's how it works. It's a layer of human-based reasoning. So think of your agentic orchestration certainly happening and orchestrating both, your agentic agents and then managing any generative AI. But there's a layer of human reasoning that sits on top. It's a studio of what they call angels, but they're really distinct angelic personalities. And they have names like fairness, compassion, transparency, wisdom, courage, prudence, justice, integrity, empathy, respect, generosity, humility, gratitude, equity, resilience, accountability, compromise, discernment, and solidarity. And that one of the things that we all fear when we're sort of deploying AI in these mission critical decision type areas is AI making decisions that are ultimately not favorable to humans. Well, in this work where we're really trying to do very complex supply demand matching, then human values really work. So we deployed kind of our first gen matching engine. And inside of that matching engine, we use angelic intelligence. To give you kind of one of the early examples that we had two food banks that really had come into our platform and registered for donations. And one food bank said, I needed ramen noodles. And the other food bank said, I needed food. A donor came into the platform 5 miles away from the donation point that needed ramen noodles, 15 miles away from the donation point that was requesting general food, and said, all right, I'm going to post the food. Our engine does the matching. Now, traditional engines would match. They ask for ramen. We match ramen. They're 5 miles away. What's not to like? Boom, here's the allocation. The angelic intelligence said, wait a minute. Yeah, that one's 15 miles away. So yeah, there is more miles there. They didn't ask for ramen. They asked for food. Let me ask why. And it went and examined that they were out of all food. They were completely out of stock. But the first food bank had enough food to keep going for the next 3 weeks. So angelic intelligence said, I'm sending that ramen to that location that is completely out of food because those people are dependent. It is not a decision that you'd ever get to because every conventional optimization, keyword match, logistical optimization would actually just, be done and moving on to the next business problem. But then angelic intelligence comes back and tells us why it made that decision and how it overrode the cost metric and the keyword match to get to a more equitable, empathetic, and fair solution. That's just a teeny piece. Now imagine doing that at scale across hundreds of millions of transactions, and you've automated the ability to do business through the lens of humanity. And that's what we're going for here.
No, it's amazing. It's the ethical and emotional quotient that's been missing from the AI side of things. So, Steve, always great to speak to you. How is the best way to get in touch with you? Is it LinkedIn? You can go to supplychainsavestheworld.com. I guess is probably the best way I'll get to you now.
Yeah, supply chain, Steve at supplychainproject.org, LinkedIn are great places to DM me. But Steve at the supplychainproject.org. Visit our website, www.thesupplychainproject.org. And this is a big year. We've got some great things that we'll be sort of rolling out this year, and some new partnerships. And we're kind of excited about the trajectory and getting great support from the community, Ali.
Yeah, and I think the biggest takeaway from our talk today, and we've had many talks over the years, is just the bottleneck for doing more good is the supply chain and the infrastructure. And unless we don't solve that problem, it's gonna take a little bit longer for us to fulfill that supply and demand mismatch, which is always happening. To your point with the two final food banks you were speaking to. So thank you, and Steve, for your time, and thank you for everyone who took the time to listen to this. And best of luck with all the nonprofit stuff and for-profit stuff you do. And thank you for being a mentor to the community and different generations in the community. So, and with that, I'll adjourn the meeting and adjourn the podcast.
Thanks, Ali. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.